this case, well, this article does jump around quite a bit from the present to the past, but I promise if you stick with me, it will make total sense. I'm just gonna get right into it here. Oops. Oh, why do you always do this? Okay. Los Angeles Police Department Detective Stephanie Lazarus has a very expressive, elastic face. At age 51, she looks at least 10 years younger. Her straight brown hair is shoulder length, with bangs that fall at an angle to either side of her forehead, and her manner is outgoing and friendly. She's pretty, even as middle age has begun to tug at her face. She smiles and laughs easily and has a wide range of comical facial expressions, but also a quick, harsh temper. She can turn on a hard, weathered expression, a look that means business, and is useful for someone who has spent the last quarter of a century as a cop. On the morning of June 5th, 2009, Lazarus reported for work to the Parker Center, the LAPD administration building downtown, where she was surrounded by many of her longtime colleagues and friends. She was a respected, well-known figure in the department. No, more than that. In this close-knit world, she was, in her own way, legendary. She had worked her way up from a patrol car to the art theft division, a fascinating job that was about more than just crime fighting. It had a public relations aspect to it, in that stolen art goods seemed to be stolen from homes and galleries of some of LA's most notable citizens. Lazarus had a reputation for being tenacious, tough, and strictly by the book. In fact, in all of her years in the department, she never had a disciplinary hearing. Not one. She had covered most of the desired positions in the department in units such as DARE, or the Drug Abuse Resistance Education Program, Homicide, and Internal Affairs. Everyone knew Stephanie, and they couldn't help but like her, despite her apparent perfection. She was usually chipper and fun. She married a fellow officer. She had started up a department child care program, initiated a child safety ID program. She was one of those people that people described as simply a privilege to know. When Detective Dan Jaramillo asked Stephanie for help that morning, she was particularly eager to oblige. He told her they had arrested someone who had information about an art theft and asked her if she'd go downstairs with him to the building's basement jail facility to interrogate the suspect. They walked downstairs together, chatting amiably. Before they entered the holding area, as a matter of routine, they checked their weapons. Lazarus was led into a small interrogation room with pale blue walls and soundproof tiles from waist level to the ceiling. Here, Jaramillo introduced her to his partner, Greg Stearns. They asked Lazarus to take a seat in the chair ordinarily given to the interrogatee. This clearly felt odd to her. She had a concerned, querulous look on her face as she sat down, but was still very friendly. She was here to help. I friends. We lived in the dorm for 2 years. You guys lived in the same dorm? Yeah, Distrika. Okay, said Jaramillo. You guys were just friends, and anything else? Well, yeah, we were good friends. Was there any kind of relationship or anything that developed between you two guys? Yeah, Stephanie said, kind of mildly put off. This was personal, but she was in her fraternal mode, which ran deep. She seemed determined to be helpful. I mean, we dated, you know. Then she leans forward and asks confidently, cop to cop, I mean, what's this all about? Well, it's relating to his wife. Okay. Why are you asking me such bizarre questions out of the blue? She seemed to think. Did you know her? Not really. I mean, I know he got married years ago. Did you ever meet her? God, I don't know. Did you know who she was or anything? Well, let me think. She leaned back in her chair and looked off for a moment, closing her eyes. Her expression conveyed annoyed surprise, but Jaramillo was speaking softly and politely, so she was on board. God, it's been a long time ago, she said, twisting her face at last in an exaggerated grimace, as if the question had been preposterous, but she was still willing to comply. I may have met her. Jeez, she said, raising her hands in exasperation. You know. John Rudden was crazy about Sherri Rasmussen. They met in the summer of 1984. John was a talkative young man, charming with a thick mop of dark hair, and as handsome as a male model. Sherri, a tall Scandinavian beauty with light brown hair, a broad face and high cheekbones, and wide-set eyes under dark, arching eyebrows. Both were lean and athletic runners, and both were on a fast track. He was a recent graduate of UCLA, and she, just 2 years older at 27, was already the director of nursing at Glendale Adventist Medical Center. Sherri was hot stuff. She had entered Loma Linda University at age 16 and now lectured internationally on critical care nursing. She was beautiful and considered brilliant. She was also confident and directed. She was the kind of person that John wanted to be, or entrances on the ground floor in the back alley. Just above the garage was a small balcony before two sliding glass doors. The garage itself was just wide enough for their two cars. Sherri's BMW was gone, and there were shards of broken glass on the pavement at the garage entrance. John's first thought was that this must be glass from one of the car windows. She must have run into something pulling out. Weeks earlier, she had clipped the door and broken the aerial on her car, and he thought, uh-oh, what did she do now? He lifted the plastic bag of dry cleaning out of the car and headed up the garage stairs into the living room. It wasn't until he saw the inner door to their living room ajar that he grew concerned. Sherri was dead on the floor of the living room. She was on her back on the brown rug, her face swollen and battered. She was barefoot, still in her red bathrobe, and at first he thought, well, maybe she was asleep, but when he saw her face, he knew. As he would tell a detective later, we were in trouble. Those who pass away violently leave life in mid-stride, often with a look of terminal surprise on their face, frozen. Sherri's robe was thrown open, her arms were raised and bent, and one long, slender leg was slightly raised and bent at the knee. She appeared to be fixed in the act of trying to get up. John touched her leg, and it was stiff, her skin cold. He put his fingers to her wrist to feel for a pulse, and there was none. He was struck, and struck is the right word, by the sheer impossibility of what he saw. You hear about such things, of course. There would be 831 homicides in LA that year, but hearing about them never made the prospect of such a thing possible in your own life. Here was Sherri, so alive to him in every way, still so vividly, shockingly present, and yet irredeemably, utterly gone. Her face was covered in dried blood, the right eyelid bluish, puffy, and closed. Her left eye open and staring up, her mouth open in a final gasp. She had been deceased for hours. Just below the rim of her delicate, form-fitting pink camisole, right in the center of her chest, was a bullet hole. John phoned 911. You know, Lazarus had said with exasperation. She wasn't going to get angry, but she clearly considered questions about the wife of some long-ago boyfriend to be none of their business and completely out of line. But Jaramillo pressed on. Let me ask you, he said. You said you dated John. How long did you guys date? This was finally too much for Stephanie. I mean, what? Is this something? She asked, looking mystified. Stephanie, here's the situation, Greg Stern said. Basically, we knew when we saw in this chrono that there was some relationship there. That's what this chrono seems to indicate, and we didn't want to come up to your desk at work and ask you these kind of questions or anything. Stephanie was experienced enough at this to have realized by now she was being played, and she might have just stood up and walked out, but how would that look? Stephanie remained friendly, if a little annoyed. You could see she wanted to know what was going on, which was reason enough for her to stay. I mean, God, it's been 1,000,000 years ago, she said, but she was willing to proceed. She described her relationship with John in college, all the while shaking her head in bewilderment. They'd hung around together with a group of friends. years. I can't remember how he said he met her. It's been so long. Did you go to their wedding? No, I didn't go to their wedding. No, I can't even tell you when they got married. It's been a million years. Do you know what happened to his wife? Yeah, I know she got killed. Well, when did you hear about that? I saw a poster here at work. The crime scene itself was meticulously documented for 1986. It looked as though there had been a fight. One of the room's tall stereo speakers was knocked over, lying beside Sherri on the rug, its top flush against her head. The wires had been removed from it. A gray ceramic vase with a heavy base lay shattered on the floor. The top two shelves of a wooden display cabinet had been knocked askew, and an amplifier and receiver dangled forward on top of the TV. At the base of the stairs leading up from the living room to the second floor, a VCR and CD player had been stacked neatly, as if assembled for carrying out, but then left behind. There was a single bloody smudge on top of the CD player. There were smears of blood all over the east wall and another on the front door. On the floor just inside the front door were two intertwined cords. One was apparently the wire from the fallen speaker. Upstairs, one of the two glass sliding doors to the back balcony was shattered. This was the glass that John had seen on the pavement outside the garage. No sign of forced entry, and other than the objects left on the living room floor, no sign of ransacking. Homicide Detective Lyle Mayer discovered that a pink and pale green quilted blanket on the living room chair had a bullet hole in it with powder burns. He recognized two of what turned out to be 3 holes in Sherri's chest as contact wounds. In other words, it appeared that after the first shot, a gun had been placed against her chest and fired point blank twice, and it appeared that the killer had used the blanket to muffle the sound. 2 bullets were recovered from Sherri's body, both .38 caliber. One of the bullets must have passed completely through her. Any of these 3 shots alone would have been rapidly fatal. Someone had wanted to really make sure she was dead. In addition to the wounds on her face, it was likely that she had been struck over her right eye with the vase. There was a bite mark on her left and her forearm. It would be swabbed for saliva samples, and a cast would be taken for possible tooth comparisons. John told the police about his day, retracing his steps for them. Over the next few weeks, police investigators under Mayer's supervision interviewed neighbors, family members, and friends, but they turned up no suspects. The silver BMW was found a week later, parked on the street in Van Nuys, unlocked with the keys in the ignition. Investigators found several fingerprints in it, a spot of blood, and a strand of brown hair. Research and neighborhood interviews revealed that 2 Latin men had been breaking into houses in the area, and in one case, they assaulted a woman. The opinion Mayer formed that first day would not change. I believe your house was burglarized today, sometime before 10 a.m., he told a distraught John that night, just hours after the shocked husband had to call 911. After more than an hour of detailed questioning, the detective assured John was, as she said over and over, 1,000,000 years ago. When you heard about John's wife being killed, what was your reaction? Asked Jeremillo. I obviously called the family. I called some of his friends that I knew. Obviously, it's shocking to hear. Did you know the circumstances regarding her death? Geez, let me think back. Geez, she said, I don't know if it was a burglary or something. It's been too many years. I can faintly think that I may have seen a flyer that must have had her picture on it. That's what I see. If somebody called me, I may not have known what her name was. I may have. Maybe if you told me, I'd remember it. Do you remember her assured her that there was nothing between him and this woman anymore, and they'd been dorm pals long before lovers, and the relationship had never been that serious. But still, Sherri did not want him to wax those skis. According to Nels, John did not back her up. He would not stand up to this woman, suggesting to Sherri that it would be better to placate her. The lady cop had come by again, unannounced, to pick up the skis. Sherri told her father, which John had waxed despite her objections. That time, she asked the woman to leave after John handed over the skis, making it clear she was unwelcome. But this had not deterred the woman at all. She'd shown up again, this time in her LAPD uniform, gun strapped to her waist. She said she was on a break. John had gone to work, and Sherri was still home, but usually it was the other way around. Immediately, Sherri starts to wonder if this is some kind of routine. Fiance leaves for work, old girlfriend stops by. She didn't want to believe it. She trusted John, and their wedding was just weeks away. She cried on the phone, telling her father about it that night, and Sherri did not cry easily. She discussed it more with her father when she and John visited Tucson for her birthday. According to Nels, she said she wished John would just step in and tell this woman to leave them alone. All he would do was assure her that there was nothing going on between them, and the best thing was just to ignore her, and she would eventually go away. Then there was the visit this woman made to Sherri's office at the hospital. The visit that Stephanie would admit to 23 years later, screwing up her face with the effort to remember something so trifling. It wasn't like we went out to lunch or anything, Sherri had told her father about this meeting in detail, though. She said the woman had burst into her office at Glendale, right past the secretary outside of her door, and this time the lady cop was dressed in tight short shorts and a tube top, an outfit that shouted her sexuality and athleticism. Nels brought all of this to Detective Mayer's attention the day after her murder, and it was his immediate question: have you ever checked out John's ex-girlfriend, the lady cop? He would recall that Mayer dismissed the suggestion out of hand, and Nels was told that he watched too many cop shows on TV. It's hard to believe that Mayer's focus would remain so stubbornly narrow. In a sense, the detective and the distraught husband had boxed them in on the night of the murder. Mayer seems to have seriously considered only two possibilities. Number one, that John had killed Sherri. As we know, most slain women are killed by their intimate partners. Number two, she had been killed by home intruders. The obvious implication of the stereo equipment stacked and left on the floor. Mayer ruled John out as a suspect after talking with him at length. No motive, no insurance, no evident trouble in the relationship. You could not help but feel for John. His pain was palpable, unmistakably genuine. The detective was a kind man, and it is clear from their conversation that night he liked John, and he came to believe and trust him. In fact, he told John as much at the end of their conversation. So when John dismissed out of hand the notion that an ex-girlfriend might have done this, Mayer was more inclined to believe him than Nels, the angry, grieving father-in-law who seemed to have such irrational suspicion of and dislike for the poor, grieving husband. Oh, that article is wrong. He was her father, not father-in-law. He was John's father-in-law. Speaking with the detective, John disputed Nels's stories. He told Mayer that there was no way the confrontations that his father-in-law described would have happened without Sherri telling him about it. Why would Sherri not have told him the same thing she told her father? She had told John about the hospital visit, but not in a way that made him feel like she was frightened or even intimidated. What Sherri conveyed to him was her concern that there might still be something going on between him and Stephanie, which was not true. Sherri may have decided it would be better to deal with the Stephanie problem herself, and that was in fact what Sherri told Nels she was going to do the last time they had spoken about it. There may have been another reason that Nels hadn't heard. There appears was shocking and perhaps even criminal. The case record suggests that one or more persons during the initial investigation and continuing through the next 10 years were not just disinclined to consider that one of their own had murdered Sherri Rasmussen, but actively conspired to hide evidence that may have proved it. For one thing, all of the records in the Rasmussen file pertaining to Nels's suspicions about the lady cop, and even the interview with John the day after the murder where he discussed Stephanie with Mayer, are missing. There are audio recordings and notes of every other interview in those first days, which is standard operating procedure, but there were none for the ones where Stephanie was specifically mentioned. These are conversations remembered both by Nels and John, who were interviewed independently with no knowledge of what the other had said. And as we shall see, this suspicious behavior continues in the coming years. Soon after the murder, Nels was shown sketches of 2 Latin male suspects, and the burglary theory was explained. There was no way for him to recognize these drawings, and this whole scenario just did not make sense to him. He had to wonder about the competence of these detectives. The apartment showed signs of a fight. Mayer estimated that the struggle may have lasted for up to an hour and a half. Nels wondered, how could his daughter have fought off 2 men for that long? There was a bite mark on her forearm, which led Mayer's partner, Steve Hooks, to conjecture that the suspect may have been a woman, on the theory that women are biters. But the notion was dismissed. Women don't typically engage in breaking and entering and fighting. And fighting men have been known to use their teeth. There was a period there. There was also the bullet wound in the center of Sherri's chest and the hole and powder burns on the blanket. Mayer told Nels his daughter had not simply been shot and killed. She had been assassinated. Why would a burglar do that? Nels asked if they had checked to see if the lady cop had been working that day. Had they examined her, taken pictures of her? The answer was no. No one ever checked up on Stephanie. Mayer or Hooks or someone apparently did talk to her on the phone eventually, and the conversation was enough to close that line of inquiry. In fact, there's only one brief entry in the file that mentions her, recorded on November 19th, 1987, more than a year and a half after the murder. It reads, John Radden called, verified Stephanie Lazarus, P.O., was former girlfriend. No arrests were ever made, and the evidence of Sherri Rasmussen's murder was packed away in commercial storage. In the interrogation room on that June day, 23 years later, the questioning of Stephanie Lazarus has ground on. And you're saying when you went to see her, do you remember if it was at her house or the place she worked? No, I'm thinking it was probably, well, for some reason, I want to say, I'm thinking maybe the hospital was kind of on my way to work in Hollywood, and that's maybe sounding familiar. Oh, okay. So, if it was en route to work, you would have more than likely gone to her work and had this discussion with her. That is sounding familiar now that you guys are bringing it up. It sounds familiar, but again, what does this have to do with me dating him and her being killed? I don't have anything to do with it. Again, Stephanie saw the connection they seemed to be making, but wanted to leave open the real chance that they weren't. Jaramillo rapidly retreated from the idea that she was a suspect, and Stearns changed course. Like I said, we literally just got this the other day, and we were going through it, and we saw your name. Yeah, and then you saw that I work next door. Right, we recognize the name, and we know you work next door, so we're just trying to get some background. We're trying to figure it out. This is from a really long time ago. Jaramillo had another question, though. Let me ask you this. Did detectives ever reach out to you? No, no one has ever talked to me about him, she said. And then she caught herself screwing up her face and thought again. There would be record of her having talked to a detective. No, I'm thinking I did talk to a detective, she said. division was it? Van Nuys. Thinking I did speak to somebody. Nels Rasmussen never gave up. He and his wife put up a $10,000 reward and cooperated with the producers of a TV show called Murder 1, which developed a segment about the unsolved case. He kept calling LAPD detectives over the year, asking, always, if they had checked out the lady cop. When he read the first stories about the DNA testing in crime labs a few years later, he called, and he urged the department to run the tests on the forensic evidence gathered from the apartment and from Sherri's body. There was blood and hair samples, and the swab taken from the bite mark on Sherri's arm. He was told that the department had a limited budget, and they couldn't afford to run such tests, so he offered to pay for the tests themselves. He even found a lab willing to do the work. He said he was told that the DNA would do them no good without a suspect, which may have been true. But Nels said, well, I do have a suspect. But he would not get to test the evidence. A detective named Phil Morit had visited the LA County Coroner's Office in the Mission Junction District on October 11th, 1993, more than 7 years after the murder, and not very long after Nels had requested the DNA test. And this man had signed out all of the forensic samples that might have been contained a suspect's DNA. Now, it's not unusual for a detective to remove evidence and deliver it for testing to the lab, and sometimes such errands involve fetching evidence from several case files. So really, there's no way to know if Morit on this trip sought only the Rasmussen material. Ordinarily, evidence would be removed at the request of an investigator, and there's no record of such a request here. Morit would later tell department investigators that he had no memory of signing out these samples. The evidence just disappeared. For 18 years, Sherri's file and what was left of the evidence from the scene of her murder sat in storage. Mayer retired, and in 1989, John was reunited with Stephanie Lazarus on a scuba trip to Hawaii. Before he met her there, he told investigators he'd called Mayer to make sure that no evidence had ever linked her to Stephanie's murder. It's interesting to me, and the author of this article, that the possibility which he had so strongly rejected remained firm in his mind. As he would recall it later, Mayer assured him there were no suspicions about Stephanie whatsoever. Notes about that conversation are not in the Rasmussen files, so the lady cop and the widower reconnected in Hawaii. John remarried some year later, and he and his second wife started a family. Stephanie married a fellow cop and continued to rise in the ranks. And here is where things surely would have remained, except in 2001, Jim Nuttall had a row of murder books, as they're called. Thick blue binders full of notes, photos, diagrams, transcripts. Just inside this binder cover is a progress report, a detailed account of everything that has been discovered about this case to date. One of the murder books that Jim had was for Sherri Rasmussen's case, and in reviewing it one day, he saw the same contraindication that Jennifer Francis had seen. Mayer had theorized Sherri was killed by two men committing a burglary, but the DNA report showed that the suspected killer was a woman. Back in the interview room, Detective Jaramillo returned to the question of whether or not Stephanie had ever been to John and Sherri's home. "I don't think I've ever gone there," she said. "I don't want to say I've never gone there, and have you say, oh, I was there at a party, but like I said, I don't think so." "But it's safe to say you only would have been there for something social?" asked Stearns. "Something social, yeah. I don't even know where they lived." "But you didn't have any issues with her, right?" asked Jaramillo. "No," she said, contorting her face at such a preposterous suggestion. "I mean, if you were dating me and dating her, I probably said, hey, pick, or something. I can't say that we ever screamed or yelled at each other. I mean, he was a pretty mellow guy. You know, and I like to think I was pretty mellow. I don't think we ever had some huge blow-up. I mean, would you have ever remembered if she snapped on you, like, hey, that's my man, you know, leave him alone, blah, blah, that kind of stuff? You would remember an incident like that?" "Well, you know, maybe that happened. Gosh, it's been so long ago. I mean, it's not ringing a bell." "I'm crazy," she said, giggling nervously. "People think I'm really hyper, and I get upset, you know, but I can forget 5 seconds later." "Water under the bridge," offered the detective. "I enjoy the job. I get excited. I've always enjoyed the job." "You've got a good gig," he said. Whenever Stephanie found herself on dangerous ground, she'd gone from having no memory of John's murdered wife to a possible love triangle to a confrontation in Sherri's hospital office that may or may not have become heated. She would retreat to the safe topic of the job. The original premise of this conversation, with just one cop pitching in to help her brothers, but the more she talked, the deeper the story grew. "Well, one of the concerns I had," said Jaramillo, just looking at some of the notes, is some of Sherri's friends said that you and she were having a problem because of the John situation. Stephanie puckered up her face and chuckled. In a while, Jaramillo came back to the subject again. "You know what? I just can't say," Stephanie said. "You can't say?" "No, I mean, that doesn't even ring a bell." "I mean, it seems like you actually would recall something if someone's gonna go off on you, right?" "I mean, well, it would, I think." "Well, let me ask you. At the hospital, it never got to a point where people are going, hey, you know, or everybody to your own corner type of thing?" "Oh, I don't think so. was trying to reach the panic button on the security panel. The killer pursued and stopped her before she got there. They fought savagely, and Sherri had apparently managed to briefly get her assailant's gun away from her and place her in a headlock. The killer then bit Sherri's forearm to break free, picked up the heavy gray ceramic vase from the living room shelf, and crashed it hard into her forehead. The blow would have been enough to daze Sherri, if not knock her all the way to the floor. The killer then retrieved the gun and fired the first shot that hit Sherri. It went clean through Sherri's chest. She began bleeding internally and would have had only minutes to live. She was now down for good. Using the blanket to muffle the sound, the killer then fired 2 more rounds into her chest, finishing the job. Once you started to look at it that way, the evidence of burglary looked less convincing. The bloody smudge on the top of the CD player was pretty telling. It would prove to be Sherri's blood, left by someone wearing a glove, which meant that the CD player had been stacked and gathered after Sherri was killed. If the killer had panicked after shooting her looking to flee, then why go searching for things to steal and then leave them stacked on the floor? What it looked like to the Van Nuys detectives was not a robbery scene, but an effort to make a murder scene look like an interrupted robbery. Jennifer Francis's DNA work showed without any doubt that Sherri's killer had been female. So the Van Nuys detective wondered what woman in Sherri's life would have wanted her dead, and had the presence of mind to alter the crime scene significantly or sufficiently to fool a busy LAPD homicide detective. They noted in the comprehensive murder book that on November 19th, 1987, Mayer had written, John Rudin called, verified Stephanie Lazarus P.O. was former girlfriend. What did P.O. mean? When they guessed police officer, they ran the name through the department directory and came up with her esteemed colleague in the art theft division. Nuttall and Martinez went to see John. You have this information already, detective, he told them. He'd said Stephanie had been Nels's theory and that he had never believed it. In fact, still refused to believe it. The Van Nuys detective called Nels, who, after 2 decades of getting nowhere, was understandably annoyed. How many times did he have to tell them about Stephanie Lazarus? Detectives tried to imagine how a cop might go about planning a murder. She wouldn't do it on duty. She would do it on a day off. Stephanie had been off work on the day of the murder. A cop would be careful. She would wait until the victim was alone. After the murder, she would want to leave the scene in a way that minimized being seen clearly enough to be identified. The killer had entered the garage from the inner door and driven away inside Sherri's BMW. Then there was the murder weapon. Martinez said he doubted a cop would plan to commit murder with her duty gun. You'd want to get rid of it afterward, and there is hell to pay in the department for losing a duty gun. The Van Nuys detectives knew that most cops have at least 2 weapons, a duty gun and a backup purchased privately and duly registered. Records showed Stephanie had purchased a .38 caliber Smith & Wesson soon after graduating from the police academy. Martinez suspected that after the murder, she would have gotten rid of it. If she became a suspect, the first thing her investigating colleagues would ask was to see both guns, and it would look very suspicious to say, I don't know where it is, or I lost it. Martinez traced the serial number of Lazarus's backup Smith & Wesson, and it turned out she had reported it stolen to the Santa Monica police in March of 1986, just weeks after the murder. Now, all of this evidence had been available to detectives back in 1986, if they'd been looking at Stephanie. Why hadn't they? And by now, detectives were beginning to see a pattern in the evidence missing from the case file. It sure looked as if someone inside had been trying to protect her. If ever a man had reason to be angry at the LAPD, it was Nels Rasmussen. There's a set procedure in-house for investigating a fellow officer. You first report it up your chain of command. But the detectives did not want anyone in their Van Nuys office to know about chatting with the detectives an hour into the interrogation, and if she was annoyed, she was doing a good job of not showing it. Like I said, we're looking at this case. We read the notes as far as Sherri's friends saying you guys had problems or words and it got heated, Jeremy said. The reason we're asking you if there was an incident at her work that occurred. They also said there was an incident at her house. Stephanie screwed up her face as if to say, whatever. You know what, she said, shaking her head and smiling. That doesn't sound familiar at all, but if someone says I was there and I had an incident with her, that just doesn't sound right. Was John there? Did John say this happened? Were other people there? I just don't recall it. This was the incident where you showed up. You weren't supposed to show up, and things got heated. Jeremy was now referring directly to the murder. The detective was actually affording Stephanie an opportunity here. Is it possible she just showed up to talk to Sherri and they got into it verbally and then physically? That would be bad enough, but manslaughter is not the same as premeditated murder. Stephanie did not take this opportunity. At his house, that just doesn't sound familiar, it just doesn't sound familiar at all. It's not sounding familiar because you don't remember. You know what? I'll have to say I don't remember because I don't remember. It doesn't sound familiar. Why would you not remember something like that in your life? Well, I would think. Did you ever fight with her? Stearns asked.